trades and dismissals that marked his career, and what in effect was a 13-year exile from the major leagues. Had we known Hornsby as many people in the little universe of organized baseball knew him, we might have expected just about what we all got that night in Beaumont. More than 20 years earlier, the venerable St. Louis sports writer John B. Sheridan observed that Hornsby is, as the French say, deficient in the social relation. Hornsby can be cold, indifferent, even rude. As cold as tempered steel, was the way another acquaintance described him. He cares little for what anyone says, and still less for what they think. Travis Jackson, Hornsby's teammate on the 1927 New York Giants, remembered that he had a good way of making everybody irritated, while Les Tichy, who pitched briefly for the St. Louis Browns when Hornsby managed them in the mid-1930s, was rather more explicit. Rogers Hornsby, now there was a real P-R-I-C-K. Cold, gruff, aloof, loner, such adjectives show up with remarkable frequency in contemporary recollections of Hornsby. Acquaintances also noted his extraordinarily clear blue eyes. Steel blue, said most people. Large, tawny eyes, not unlike a mountain lion's, recalled a former teammate. Go to hell eyes, in the journalist Westbrook Pegler's phrase. Hornsby was also, by his own admission and nearly everybody else's account, bluntly honest and utterly lacking in tact. I have never been a yes-man, he declared during spring training with his 1950 Beaumont team. When a man asks me a question, I believe he wants me to give him an honest answer, no matter who it hurts. But some of the owners don't want that. They want the answer that they want to hear, but that's not the way I was brought up. More than all my honors in 48 years of baseball, he insisted less than a year before he died, I'm proudest of the fact that I am not a baseball hypocrite. I've never taken back anything I ever said, and I've never failed to say exactly, and I mean exactly, what I was thinking. To everybody, from the owner to the bat boy. Hornsby, a long-time friend believed, was as addicted to the truth as a drunk was to his bottle. Plenty of people, especially teammates, players on teams he managed, club owners who employed him, and no doubt his first two wives, found his tactlessness insufferable. But for baseball writers covering his career over the decades, his candor was his most attractive feature. Usually a good interview subject, Hornsby boasted of never saying anything off the record. The most personable thing about Hornsby, enthused Bozeman Bulger of the New York World in 1927, is his frankness. He says what he thinks, without any thought of what effect his words will have. If he believes a thing, he says it. Bulger might have added that whatever Hornsby had to say was usually punctuated with profanity and scatology. When Hornsby talked, moreover, he rarely talked anything but baseball. Not only was baseball his professional livelihood, it was central to his understanding of American society, as well as the only organized athletic competition worth doing. Although he played a little football before he dropped out of high school, later on he had no use for that or any other sport besides baseball. In 1953, on the eve of the annual preseason game at Chicago's Soldier Field between the college all-stars and the reigning professional champions, he remarked to a group of visiting sports writers, "You fellers are up here for the football game. That's a goddamn lousy sport." And when he asked his grandson about his favorite sport, and the boy replied that he preferred football, Hornsby professed to be flabbergasted. Hornsby sometimes went bird hunting in late autumn, but unlike many ball players, he never took up golf, and dismissed card playing as a waste of time. He read little, and, at least during the baseball season, avoided motion pictures, convinced that both activities were bad for a hitter's precious eyesight. That he'd never tasted liquor or tobacco was one of the best-known facts about him. J. Roy Stockton of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch once contrasted Hornsby's personality and habits to those of Frank Frisch, the brilliant second baseman for whom Hornsby was traded in 1926, in what was probably the most sensational player exchange in baseball history up to then. Frisch, a Fordham University graduate, smoked, danced, liked to read and garden, and could play the guitar. He kept a decent stock of wine, enjoyed travel, and went in for photography and amateur movie-making. "Hornsby," Stockton said, "never read a book in his life, and doesn't even read the daily newspaper, except perhaps the headlines and the baseball columns." Hornsby had never held a camera or a musical instrument, never spaded a flower garden, never smoked or chewed tobacco. For Hornsby, the chief value of travel was to get from one baseball town to another. He didn't dance, and his comment on music was, "How the devil can a fella talk baseball with those fellers making all that racket with them instruments?" Stockton exaggerated, though not by much. It's notable that Hornsby never took issue with Stockton's less than flattering characterization. The two remained on good terms for the half-century they knew each other. One who likes to judge people by stereotypes might explain Hornsby as basically a Texan, born in 1896 on the state's semi-arid plains, raised mostly in Fort Worth, and buried in the family plot in a cemetery near Austin. Although he lived outside the state most of his adult life, he started out in professional baseball in Texas, kept up his contacts with a considerable number of Texan relatives and acquaintances, and managed teams in 2 Texas cities. Hornsby might fit the image of the Texas plainsman, laconic, hard-bitten, no-nonsense, straight from the shoulder, except for the fact that from the age of 6 he lived in an urban industrial environment. Besides, the gallery of American stereotypes offers an equally familiar Texan, the swaggering, loud-mouthed braggart and bullshitter. If stereotypes rarely explain much of anything, caricatures, particularly self-caricatures, sometimes reveal more. Over the years, Hornsby created a kind of self-caricature, which his contemporaries in the press and baseball came to accept as representing the whole truth. When he was a boy, Hornsby often said, his mother taught him not only to shun alcohol and tobacco, but, above everything, to always tell the truth. Of course, Hornsby didn't always do so. Like the rest of us, he sometimes dissembled, backtracked, contradicted himself, and outright lied. Contrary to what he let people believe, he didn't always get along with umpires. He was ejected from games on a number of occasions and drew several fines and suspensions. While he possessed the finest batting eye in the game, sometimes he swung at pitches outside the strike zone. Sometimes he even looked at called third strikes. Despite his reputation for never praising his players when they did well, "Why should I? That's what they're being paid to do," he said repeatedly. He often spoke warmly of men he managed. Hornsby insisted that he always gave his best on the ball field, and as a manager he demanded the same from his players. They owed that not to him, but to the club that paid their salaries, to the fans who paid to see them play, and most of all to themselves as professionals. Yet at least twice during his own playing career, in episodes that were well publicized at the time, but subsequently overlooked by Hornsby and everybody else, he deliberately slacked off because he was unhappy with his team's management. Although Hornsby had little contact with his older son after the breakup of his first marriage, he seems to have been a reasonably good father to his son by a second wife, at least while the boy was growing up. He generally enjoyed the company of young people, and in the many baseball schools and clinics with which he was associated, beginning in 1933, he worked to teach tens of thousands of boys the basics of the game. Regarding the one non-baseball activity that held his attention, betting on horse races, Hornsby was particularly plain-spoken. While other kinds of gambling failed to interest him, he belonged to the legion of ballplayers who liked to bet on horses. Hornsby, unlike most of his peers, bet excessively and often profligately. Although he won big on a few occasions, his losses kept him in financial straits for much of his life. Especially in the 1920s and 1930s, with the cloud of the 1919 World Series scandal still hanging over professional baseball, Hornsby's gambling habits vexed the sports officialdom and repeatedly put him at odds with the people he worked for. Hornsby never tried to conceal his fondness for putting money on a horse's nose. Over and over, he insisted that betting on a race was his only real enjoyment away from baseball, that what he did with his own money hurt nobody but himself, and that what financiers did with other people's money in the stock market was much worse.